The first time I met Matt Coles, if you know anything about not-for-profit organizations, they like to do a one-on-one ask for contributions. And I was asked to have a private meeting with Matt at a coffee shop. And we went there, and after about an hour of discussing various aspects of the law, I kind of looked at the host that was leading him around, and I said, well, aren't you going to ask me for money? And she looked at me and said, well, you two were having so much fun talking about issues that I didn't want to interrupt and ask for it. So Matt has been the director of the ACLU Lesbian and Gay Rights Project since 1995. Prior to that, you were in California doing various lobbying and legal work on domestic partnership and other LGBT rights issues. Some of the cases that Matt has been involved with while at the ACLU includes the Florida adoption case, Lawrence v. Texas, Romer, Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So without further ado and mumbling on my half, Matt Coles.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you very much. Yeah, I was about to say any bloody mess you can think of in the law and gay rights, I've had some connection with it. First, before I start, let me actually give a thanks to all of you people. I think Google has revolutionized the way most of us do work. I mean, it really has. I think I probably use it at least 5 or 6 times a day, and the people who work for me and everything from development to the law use it much more frequently. I mean, it's become almost a reflex. If something comes up that you don't know anything about, it's everybody's main screen, I think. You just hit it. So we folks working in the public interest appreciate the extent to which you've made our lives easier, and you really have made our lives easier. So thanks for that. What I want to do quickly is say a couple of words about context, about using the law to try and make change in America, to change the way society works. And then I'll quickly talk about the areas that at the ACLU that are connected to LGBT work that we work in. The thing about making change is this. You can't actually change America simply by changing the rules. Great decisions from courts, great legislation out of Congress won't usually change society unless you can get people to accept the notion that the change is right or that it ought to happen. Not necessarily to embrace it, but to accept the notion that it's right. I mean, think for a minute. In 1955, the US Supreme Court said that we were going to get rid of segregated schools in America with all deliberate speed. Now, nobody knew exactly what all deliberate speed meant, but I think in retrospect, no one would describe the process of desegregating America's schools and use the word speed in any context whatsoever. 1964, the United States Congress decided that we were going to get rid of all distinctions based on sex and gender in the workplace. And we're now up to, I think, 76 cents on the dollar. Women earn on an average 76 cents for doing the same work that men do. You don't change society just by changing the rules. You have to get people to accept it. And what that leads to in our conception of our work is that in any case, in any lobbying project, in almost anything you undertake, it is as important to focus as a goal on changing the way people think as it is to focus on actually getting the rule changed through a court decision or through a piece of legislation. And there are basically 2 ways to do that. I think of them as either macro, micro, or wholesale, retail. But what they are basically is this, is you can try and shape the cases that you do, the other projects that you work on, so that they're designed as vehicles to change the way people think. That's what I think of as wholesale or macro change. And let me give you an example. Florida has a law that says that gay people can't adopt. They can be foster parents, we can be foster parents, but we can't adopt children. We can't adopt the children that we carry through the foster care system. We brought what was the 4th challenge to this in 1997. We decided to bring the case in July of 1997, but we didn't file it until the very end of 1998. And the reason for that is not because we were doing the legal research, that was pretty much done. The reason for that was we were looking for situations that would embody what we wanted to say to people about the adoption ban. And what we wanted to say to people about the adoption ban was, this is bad for kids. So we just didn't want to build the case around a gay person who wanted to adopt. The message of that case is, this is unfair to gay people. Instead, we wanted to find families who we could show were really being harmed. And we actually hit the jackpot. We got the two guys who the state of Florida had just named as foster parents of the year, who were raising at that point 3 and ultimately 5 infants, started as infants, who tested positive for HIV when they were born. One of the kids didn't. The state decided that one of the kids eventually turned seronegative, which lots of kids who test positive for HIV at birth do. The state decided that that kid at 8 years old was placeable for adoption, but he couldn't be adopted by the two guys who'd been raising him. He couldn't be adopted into the family that he thought had his brothers and sisters because of Florida's ban on adoption. That case was tailor-made for what we wanted to do, because the message it sent out is keeping gay people from adopting denies kids homes. And what we wanted was stories that embodied what we were trying to say, not just to the courts, but to the public. So that's what I mean by wholesale change, or wholesale public persuasion. The other thing that you can do is you can try and build your cases or your legislative projects around situations or around principles which you can then use to empower people to make change at a very local, or as I would put it, at a very retail level. To give you another example of what I mean, we do a lot of schools cases. We do a lot of cases about kids who want to form gay-straight alliances in middle schools and high schools. We do a lot of cases about kids who are told, you know, they can't wear T-shirts that say "gay okay by me," that sort of thing. What we try to do with those, we take those cases, we take them through the courts. We generally win them, actually. The schools cases are relatively easy for us these days. But we never stop there. We try to take the case apart and break it down into pieces so that people can use it to get change in a very local area. To give you an example of what I mean, we'll take a case like, we just won a case in South Florida, in Lake Okeechobee, Florida. The Lake Okeechobee School District decided that it wasn't going to let kids form a gay-straight alliance because, it said, it was an abstinence-only school. And a gay-straight alliance, it said, is a sex club. And so you couldn't form a sex club in a school that was, actually they really overplayed their hand. If they'd said it's a club that's in some sense founded around sexuality, they would have had a more credible argument. But by calling it a sex club all the time, I think they really sort of undercut themselves. Anyway, we just killed them in front of a very conservative federal judge. It was great. But what we've now done is we've taken a case and we've put a letter together that says, you know, GSAs, gay-straight alliances, are not inconsistent with abstinence-only policies, and here's what a federal court in Florida said, and here's what happened, and the letter's up on the web. And so for the next group of kids that gets this same line of bullshit from a principal or from a school board that you can't have a club because we're an abstinence-only school, we've given them the letter, and what we hope they'll do is with that letter and others that are connected for the other kinds of bullshit explanations and explanations about how to put the club together, that they'll go do this themselves. And that, in the schools area, is very much what's happening. And I think in some ways you persuade the public even more powerfully at that kind of retail level. You persuade the public even more powerfully by having kids, teachers, and parents go into local school boards and local school districts and fight to establish GSAs and make people understand that they have a right to do it themselves, not necessarily with the ACLU there. We will go help people do things like that, and we'll do it through our affiliates, but we actually think it's more powerful when they're able to go do it themselves. So the idea being, again, that you have to build the cases and the projects that you work on as much to change people's minds as you do to actually get substantive changes in the rules, and that there are two ways to do it. One way is to build the cases around compelling stories that will get the public on a mass scale to understand why what the government's doing or what an employer is doing is wrong. And then on a retail scale, to empower people to go in and make change in very local school districts, in businesses and universities for themselves, and change people's minds through that direct interaction with your own employees or your own neighbors, which we think is often the most powerful way to do it. We do the work these days in 5 areas. One of them I've been talking about, schools. By and large, the issues at schools are just the 2 I've alluded to. Can we form gay-straight alliances? We've been bringing cases over that since 1994. we pretty much always win those cases now. And the fight these days is, as school districts keep inventing new creative arguments about why the kids shouldn't be able to form the club, we though go then and sue them and win. We actually had a wonderful decision a couple of weeks ago where a judge started out by saying, it's well established that kids have a right to form gay-straight alliances, and he cited 6 federal circuit court cases, and 4 of them were cases that my project had brought. One of them was a case that Lambda Legal Defense brought, and the 6th one was a case that was brought jointly by my project and Lambda Legal Defense. And it was just sort of great to look at it and say, we got you guys. We've built it up, and we've got you guys. The other big issue is T-shirts and expression, and those cases are from my standpoint, often screamingly funny. We had a great case out of a high school in North Carolina 2 years ago where a kid put up posters. He was running for student body president, and his slogan was "Queer Eye for Hunt High," and the vice principal tore them all down, saying, and I love this, saying that commercial or television-related slogans were inappropriate in a school election. And what was really great about this, of course, is that every high school student, I don't have one of these, most of you probably have them too, has a phone with a camera in it, right? So as soon as the principal explained that slogans that were commercial or television related were inappropriate, the kid went around with his phone and took pictures of all the other people's slogans. You know, we had stuff like Miller Time, which was really great for somebody named Miller who was running. Anyway, the big issues in schools are GSAs and free speech. This is a place where we really are winning. We almost always win these cases. And this is a place where I think our big push is to make it possible for students and teachers and kids to beat these policies, to set up the clubs, to wear the T-shirts, to do them stuff by themselves. Second big area is on civil rights laws. You probably all know that we don't have a federal law making discrimination in employment based on sexual orientation illegal. The good news is we're up to 20 states. We picked up 3 this year, Oregon, Colorado, and surprise, surprise, and the one I'm most personally proud of, Iowa. I think Iowa was an important, really important step forward. I mean, Oregon, you figured, right? You probably thought they must have done it years ago, right? Big surprise. Colorado seems at least about time, but Iowa was a huge step forward. A new version of the Federal Employment Non-Discrimination Act has been introduced in the House of Representatives. I think it's going to go to a floor vote, and we're going to win. I think the Republicans will block it from coming to a vote in the Senate, and I think we probably won't get that bill through Congress until there's a new president. But I think when there is a new president, our prospects of getting it are very good. So that's an area where I think things are going really well. Gender identity and expression. That's an era where I think we're about anywhere between 25 to 40 years behind where we are on LGBT rights. When we talk about gender identity and expression, what we learn at the moment, to our great regret, is the more we make people understand the issues, the worse we do. It's really amazing. We really are at a point where people simply don't understand the core issues. And what we're trying to do more than anything else is, at this point, bring cases that kind of arrest people and make them question their very basic assumptions and their very basic values. My favorite case, my favorite gender identity and expression case, is one we brought against the Library of Congress. We represent a woman named Diane Shorer. In an earlier life as Dave, she was a colonel in the Special Forces whose expertise was counterinsurgency. And after retiring, she applied as Dave for a job as a counterterrorism researcher with the Library of Congress, got the job, and then explained to her supervisor that she thought it best if she actually started work as Diane, and she had pictures and was going through the transition, and the Library of Congress decided, as they put it, that, you know, after all, it wasn't a good fit, and pulled the job offer back. What I love about this case is, well, she said to me at one point, she said, you know, I was gonna walk away from it and do nothing about it and go on with my life, and then I thought to myself, for 20 years, I parachuted into every hellhole in the world, Mogadishu, Kinshasa, Port-au-Prince, and I'm not fit to be a researcher at the Library of Congress. And what's great about the case is she says that, and people, hard-boiled people who are not normally on our side, scratch their heads. I know a guy who's a cop in Queens. He's actually the father of somebody who works for me. And he said when reading about the case, he read the thing about the case, and he said, well, Doesn't seem right. He paid his dues, or she paid her dues, whatever. And that's exactly what we wanted the case to do. We wanted the case to make people think, well, this just isn't fair. Whether you understand the overall issue or not, it doesn't seem right. That same point I was talking about more before about getting the public to accept the change, whether they agree with it or not. The fourth issue we spent a lot of time on is parenting. It's interesting, you know, when I was 25 years old, the notion of being a parent as a gay person was pretty much sort of not in the realm of possibility. And nowadays, I think it's something that virtually every LGBT person thinks about, whether they want to do or whether they don't want to do. The country's divided up basically into three different groups. There are states where if you want to be a parent and you're LGBT, there's no problem. There are states where it's against the law, more or less. Florida bars adoption. Arkansas used to ban foster parenting and tried to bar adoption. And there are a bunch of other states that, while they don't have policies that you can lay your hands on, it's effectively impossible to become an adoptive parent or a foster parent if you're LGBT. I mean, that doesn't foreclose all the possibilities, but it forecloses some of them. And then there are a bunch of states where it's simply treated as a negative factor. And what we're trying to do is, again, look for very compelling cases that will make people understand why it's wrong for kids as well as wrong for gay people to keep gay people from parenting. I mentioned the Lofton case as the fourth challenge. We're now midway through the fifth. As I'm fond of saying, the fifth time's the charm. And if the fifth time isn't the charm, the sixth time will be. What we're trying to get the state of Florida to understand is, you know, the ACLU will never go away, and we really will never go away. The last area we work in, relationships, which these days focuses more than anything else on getting recognition for same-sex couples, either through marriage or through things like civil unions and domestic partnerships. And you know, somebody said to me not long ago at a public event, well, you're not doing very well, are you? The score is 26-1, because 26 states have passed constitutional amendments, all of them banning marriage for same-sex couples, and most of them banning civil unions or something like it as well. And I said, well, you know, actually, that's not the right score. The score isn't 26-1 at all. It's 26 to one state with marriage, Massachusetts, and 6 states now with civil unions, and some real surprises popping into the civil union category in the last year. Oregon, having just passed a constitutional amendment banning marriage, passed a complete civil union. There'll probably be another initiative about that, but passed a complete civil union system. New Hampshire did it without having any kind of a court case pending. Connecticut did it without any kind of a court case. California did it without any kind of a court case. And then there are 3 states with protection that isn't as comprehensive as a civil union, but still does a lot of important things. Those states being Maine, Washington State, which just did it, and Hawaii, which did it quite a few years ago. So the way I read it, the score is 26-10. They racked up some of their wins in places where, you know, we thought progress was going to take a while anyway. I mean, I really didn't think that we were going to get marriage for same-sex couples in Alabama or Mississippi. I'm glad the people of Mississippi moved quickly to stop those radicals on the Alabama Supreme Court from making marriage available to same-sex couples, but I don't think there was really much danger of it very quickly. And I think when you look at what's happened over the last couple of years, we are definitely picking up momentum. I think we'll get marriage in New Jersey in a few years. I think we'll get the voters in Oregon to take that initiative back in about 7 years. You know, and I think it may well take, it's going to take us, I think, between 15 and 20 years to actually get complete marriage protection for same-sex couples all across the country. But folks, 20 years is not slow in the way social change works in America or anywhere else. 20 years is actually quite fast. And I think if, you know, look, you can start the gay rights movement from lots of different points, but if you pick Stonewall, the time that people like to pick, 1969, you know, we're only 28 years into this, and at 28 years, we've gotten overwhelming public support for the notion that you shouldn't be able to discriminate against people based on sexual orientation in the workplace. And we've got legal protection. We've got half the employees in the country covered through those 20 laws. We've got widespread public acceptance that kids ought to be able to come out in school, form clubs, say what they want to say. Trust me, 15 years ago, all of that was virtually unthinkable. I remember going to Flint, Michigan 15 years ago and trying to talk the local school board into appointing a committee to talk about LGBT students. And as soon as they all understood what I was there to talk about, people got up and started walking out of the room. And I grabbed one of, the most liberal member of the school board, and I said, come on, you guys got to deal with this. He said, what are you, crazy? You will all be thrown out on our ear. Similarly, as I said earlier, if we talk about when I was 25, we're talking about 30 years ago, but even 20 years ago, the thought of gay people being able to become parents, that it was a decision that most LGBT people ought to make, was not on anybody's radar screen. So I think we're making very good progress. I think as long as we don't screw it up, we can bring the relationship thing to an end within about 20 years. I think not screwing it up means keep going state by state and not relying on the Supreme Court to straighten things out for us until we get to the end of the battle, which is when the Supreme Court usually intervenes. But I think the score actually looks pretty good. And the main thing to remember as we go to make change is that you make change by changing people's minds, not just by changing the rules, and that's how we'll do it. So, people have questions?
You talk about a lot of effort being done at the state level. I have one of my very close friends is dating someone from China. We're Lesbian, went over to their China, met somebody. They've been together for a few years now. Unfortunately, they can't get married, so he can't come over here. And due to the immigration laws, or even the difficulty getting a visa for someone in China that doesn't have a lot of money, they only get to see each other when he can get enough vacation coming over there.
Right.
So my question is there anything being done at the federal level to basically represent people like him that, it wouldn't be an issue if he were straight. They'd be able to get married, they'd be able to be together. It would, several years ago when they decided to be committed to one another. Are there any efforts being done at the federal level, or is it just all grassroots state for now?
No, and you can't do anything at the state level about it because... Oh, yes, I'm sorry. The question was if it was a situation involving somebody who's a United States citizen who's fallen in love with somebody who's not a U.S. citizen. If you're straight, you can marry someone from another country who you fall in love with, and they automatically, once married, get to come into the country and become citizens, I think, after 5 years. But if you're not married, that's the only vehicle for doing that. And if that's not available, you have to find some other way, if you can, to get somebody into the country. And the question was, is anything being done about that at the federal level, or is that being done at the state level? And the unfortunate answer is doing something at the state level won't help, because even though one state allows people, Massachusetts allows people to get married, the federal government will not recognize the marriage of a same-sex couple from Massachusetts. There's a little federal law called the Defense of Marriage Act, which has the name William Jefferson Clinton at the bottom of it, as the president who signed it into law. And that law says the federal government will not recognize any marriage of a... It basically says the federal government completely defers to the states about who can get married and whether their marriages are valid, unless a state decides to marry a same-sex couple, in which case it won't recognize it. Now, I think in time, well, here's what's going on at the federal level. There's a bill in Congress called the Permanent Partners Immigration Act, and it basically would set up a second route and say if you're in a same-sex couple, even if you're not married, if you're permanent partners, probably means one of those state civil unions, but it would be set up in a way that anybody could get one, whether you lived in the state or not. Should be able to do the same thing on immigration status. So if they were to go and get a New Hampshire or a California civil union, they would be able to bring them in. I don't think there's any danger of the Permanent Partners Immigration Act passing for at least, I think, about 5 years. There are no lawsuits over this because the Constitution gives Congress plenary authority over immigration, and that means that even things that you could constitutionally challenge in other contexts are much more difficult to challenge in the context of immigration. I think we'll be able to eventually get the federal courts to take the Defense of Marriage Act down. But, this is not good news for your friend. I think that's probably 10 to 15 years off at the earliest. The courts in America have a largely undeserved reputation for charging in and forcing the society to comply with basic sort of basic constitutional rules about fairness and equality that the courts largely don't deserve. The pattern is much more that courts tend to intervene after most of the country has already abandoned the process and you're bringing the outliers into line. When the Supreme Court decided Brown against Board of Education in '55, most states did not have segregated schools. It was a minority. When the court decided Loving against Virginia in '67, getting rid of the ban on interracial marriage, only 14 states still had one. And earlier challenges, when a majority of states had them, the court never took the case. Even, back in 1986, in what was probably the worst gay rights case of all times, the Supreme Court decided that it was all right for states to make intimate relationships between same-sex couples a crime. There were 24 states that had laws like that at the time. The court reversed itself in 2003 in a case against Lawrence against Texas. Only 13 states still had bans when that happened. So I don't think we can count on the federal courts to take DOMA down for us until we've gotten a kind of a much bigger critical mass of states that are marrying same-sex couples and giving them civil unions. So I think for your friend at the moment, the news isn't great. There's a little website called 10couples.org that I suggest that people go to. It's a really good little site about, it's really just 10 same-sex couples, and it's kind of a good exposure to what life is really like in America for same-sex couples. And one of the couples is actually in Canada, and the guy's a decorated Navy veteran, and his partner is from, I think, Hong Kong. And neither country would let the other one in, and so eventually they found another country, Canada, that would allow them to get married, become citizens, and live together. And I think it's a great little story of how more ridiculous can you get this. This is a decorated Navy veteran who, devoted his life to serving his country and has to give it up to be with the man he loves. But I think we're going to have to tell America a lot more stories like that before we get there. Sorry, long answer. Yeah. Oh, yeah, please.
Just to add to that, so the Permanent Partners Immigration Act is now called the Uniting American Families Act.
Okay.
And it has quite a few sponsors in the House, but I agree with you that it probably won't pass anytime soon. And there's another organization called Immigration Equality, which also, if your friend doesn't know about, he should probably know about. And they're the ones that are lobbying for the UAFA, right. And they're definitely looking for stories from couples that like exactly what you described, where they're having trouble, being together and stuff like. It's called Immigration Equality.
Yeah. It's the stories have. I think. I have a very personal connection to this, and because my partner was not a U.S. citizen, and he just got his green card a couple of weeks ago. It was a great moment. It really was a great moment. Kind of 5 years of living on tenterhooks because he was on an extended visa, which meant if he lost his job, and he was working for an internet startup, if he lost his job, and that actually happened once before when he was on his regular, he was working for an internet startup, the company collapsed, and he was able to start again. But this time, if he'd lost his job, he would have had to leave the country. And it can make you really crazy, but we were really lucky. But the stories really have good traction with the American people, I think. Surprisingly good traction. You will hear people say, immigration, forget it, it's not going to get anywhere. But when people, sort of hear really good stories, I still like the man who gave up his country, or, people who've fallen in love and spend. In our New York marriage case, we had a couple, one guy from Taiwan, I think, and one guy from New York, and they were living this life of a few months a year in Taiwan and a few months a year in New York, and vacations, and the guy was getting, temporary appointments as a teacher. I think those stories really move people. So have I told you everything that you could possibly want to know? Yeah, go ahead. Or not. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you expect to win that case?
The question is about the Charlene Nguyen case. Do I expect to win? I expect to win part of it. I expect to win the part about outing her to her parents, which is actually, for my money, the most important part of it. We did a case like this in Pittsburgh, actually, a few years back, a really awful, awful case of two kids who were they were in the back seat of a car in a parking lot behind a liquor store, but whatever was going to go on hadn't really, but there were beer cans in the car. So the cops arrested him, took him down to the station. The cops said to one of the kids, you need to tell your grandfather that you're a homosexual, and if you don't, I'm going to call him tomorrow morning and do it. And the kid went home and took his own life in a very gruesome way. And we got a very good decision from the Court of Appeals in Philadelphia that gay kids have a right to privacy, and authorities do not have the power to out them to their families. But as is often the case in the law, we need another one, and I'm counting on Charlene to be that. I think on the discriminatory treatment on the suspension, I think it's going to be much harder. You know, what happened is they brought in all the officials who said, no, we would have done exactly the same thing to straight kids who'd kissed, which is total bullshit. And once again, actually, we had people out with their camera phones, and we have tons of pictures of kids making out in front of the principal's office. But I still, you know, our clients were high school kids, and high school kids don't make the best witnesses. I know this will come as a shock, but they really don't. And I think that part of the case is going to be a lot tougher to win. But who knows? He's actually, the case went to a trial. The school district made us go to trial. The case went to a trial last October. So it's been a long time, and we don't know exactly what's going to happen. I will guarantee you this, that whatever happens, I mean, we'll appeal. Well, we won't appeal if we win, but they will. I mean, the case is going to go up on appeal in any case, and it's going to go to the Court of Appeals, which is a good thing, because I think, again, we'll probably win that privacy part. And schools do this to LGBT kids all the time. They call their parents and out them to their parents all the time. And I think establishing the principle that as a school, you do not have the power to do that. Kids get to decide when they have this conversation with parents, you know, absent somebody being in terrible trouble, is a really important thing to do. And so that's the part of Charlene's case I care about most. Do you guys like the video? Was it okay? Was it effective? We've never actually done this before. Actually, the ACLU has never done this before. I have somebody on my staff who has experience as a documentary filmmaker, and we basically made that for about $400. Pretty astonishing. But we're going to use it as essentially, when the decision comes down, as a video press release. Instead of just putting out the classic release, we're going to put the video out with it and try to get as much distribution to the video as we possibly can. Since you all are probably more hooked into the world of video than I am, if you have any ideas about how we might effectively do that, you can always email me at mcoles@aclu.org with your suggestions, gladly accepted. Yeah.
So I have good immigration stories. I'm an immigrant. July 4th is ironic for me. I've paid vast amounts of tax, and yet I am not represented in this country. But I've told that to all my friends. They're not people who are electing Republicans. People in this office are very broad-minded, liberal types. God knows how they vote. How do I get my story to people that won't hear it?
How do you get your story to people who won't hear it? Oh, well, you can't. I mean, you know, if you know, it's like somebody once said to me in a commercial paper class, you know, all the guarantees of the world won't help you if you're dealing with a crook. I mean, if you're dealing with somebody who's a stonehead who won't listen, you can't get your story to them. The important thing is not to get your story to people who won't hear it. Look, basically, on most LGBT issues, the country's divided into three groups. You change the issue, the size of the groups changes, but they're basically three groups. There's a group of people, it's about 20% of the public, who are simply completely unpersuadable. They really think that, you know, you and I and Hillary Clinton are the devil's ambassadors, and we're there to do the devil's work, and anything we say is just the devil talking. And we're not going to persuade those people. We're just not, and it's not worth talking to them most of the time. And then there's a group of people about the same size, about 20% of the public, who's with us all the way. Usually, unfortunately, somewhat less enthusiastically. The people in the bad 20% vote on this issue. The people in the good 20% frequently don't. They just think, yeah, sure, you guys should have all the same rights as everybody else, but it's not necessarily something they vote on, and that makes a big difference. The rest of the country sits in the middle and is generally torn between conflicting ideas. I mean, most of the rest of the country that's adult age still thinks that being gay is sinful. And so they find it, you know, think that being gay is sinful, but they think that you shouldn't lose your job unless you're no good at it. You shouldn't lose your home unless you can't make the payments. And so there's a basic kind of underlying conflict going on. And our job is to get them to think of the issues in terms of the good basic principles like fairness and equality, and not sin. And the real issue is, how do you get your story to those people? Right. Well, one thing you can do is go to the ACLU's website, and you'll find a thing that says, couples, we want your stories. And it'll take you to a very short click-down questionnaire that's a database that we collect the stories. We make them available to every one of the major national organizations working on couples and LGBT-related stuff, and lots of non-major national organizations and local ones as well. And that's the best way to pump the story. If you've got a story, it ought to be in the data bank. You can get to it through 10couples.org, you can get through ACLU.org, or you can get to it via freedomtomarry.org. And if you have a story, please go put it into that base. You know, just for years, people have believed that in order to move the Employment Non-Discrimination Act in Congress, the final few steps, we needed some really good discrimination stories. They've never been able to get them. Back in '84, I hired a guy. This was around the couple stuff. I thought the couple stories that were going to America about same-sex relationships were not the great stories. So I hired a guy who was an investigative reporter and said, go find me stories of good couples. And you know what? It worked. The great stories are really out there. And sometime go look at, again to the website, go look at the individuals who were involved in the New York marriage case, which is called Samuels and Gallagher against New York, or the Maryland marriage case, which is called Dean and Polyak against Conway. They're great stories. They're salt of the earth Americans, great stories of the things that happen to couples when you treat them as strangers and they're in really committed relationships. We've used them for the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. We've got tons of great stories, and this stuff really works. Abstract argument doesn't move people the way real stories do. So please, if you do nothing else, go to one of those 3 websites, put your story into the database. We can use you. Thanks very much. I think I've used up my time.